Welcome to the Suburban Devlog. In this episode, I'll be going over the pieces of development that I did prior to starting the devlog. I'll be going a little more in depth about Suburban's inspirations and gameplay, and I'll be working on the core of the project's combat, that is, ATB. I'm not going over the graphics rendering today because plugging them in would mean updating the shaders fairly regularly. That slows down the overall development process. Because I've made character models and fashioned animations, I can continue where I left off. I can complete the attack command. While it is the most basic move in an RPG, it's also going to be the foundation for everything else moving forward. And more importantly though, after the attack is complete, I'll be aiming to complete the fairly dreaded ATB system. Does it need to be perfect right off the bat? No, but it does need to be present in a meaningful way. We'll go over the process later, but for now, let's talk about game design. I consider the turn-based RPG to be one of the hardest genres to begin designing for. No, that's a lie. The first game I ever made was a basic text RPG on C++. RPGs can boil down to a couple of numerical variables, and you just need a bit of math to get everything working. The issue is that it's also a genre that becomes increasingly difficult the more you build on top of the basics, by an exponential margin even. Now, for something like Suburban, you need to deal damage in a very, unconventional way. Action games and platformers both use a system of hitboxes to indicate where, when, and how a target is hit. If the combat is a little more in-depth, maybe they'll need to retrieve some data outside of the player character, but otherwise you're controlling a character directly. Now, compare that to the conventional turn-based RPG, where you aren't in direct control of your units. Instead, you relay commands to an AI user from a user interface, which retrieves data from both the player character and its target. And then the action can be executed and the damage function can be done. It's sort of like puppetry. Before getting started with the devlog project, I wanted to set up a good starting foundation that I could kick off at any time. So that's things like unit placement, UI components, and more internal stuff like the combat component. It's a lot of cross-referencing. The problem for me is that there's not much I can study as far as ATB goes, so I've got to improv a bit. It's not a bad practice to study the games you play and go back to watch them frame by frame. That's what I think a lot of game developers do. As you can probably tell with the UI, I've done a little experimenting, not only with how I present information, but how it's styled. The tricky thing is that there's not actually a guaranteed right way to make a UI for an RPG. One of the most praised aspects of a game like, say, Persona 5 is its HUD. It's dynamic, it's expressive, and it's stylish, but it wouldn't really work for an action RPG like Dark Souls or Elden Ring. Right now, I'm playing around with an analog-styled UI that uses VCR fonts. It harkens back to the aesthetic trappings of the 90s, the age of home movies and amateur educational films. You'll also notice that I'm playing around with ATB bars so that faster characters will have shorter progress bars. I'll likely standardize the size in the future since the VCR has some uniformity in its UI. Attacks are the most basic command you can give a character, but it functions as a sort of foundation for other commands, like spells and items, so I wanted to put some time into getting this right. This is about the point that I stopped designing gameplay to focus on characters and animation, which is also where I started working on the devlog. UE4's in-house assets don't really provide the sort of gameplay-focused animation that I'm looking for my gameplay, and Mixamo, a free resource for 3D assets, is sort of on the same boat. My best option was just to make my own assets. Before I even start to deal damage, I want to make sure that everything works, which is more technical animation. I need to go back to my UI and fix up how targeting works. I noticed that Terry doesn't actually do anything when he attacks, except slide a little. He's stuck on his state machine, you see. That's because I'm using something called an anim montage to fire off my animation. For simplicity's sake, think of anim montages as an animation that can interrupt and override current animations playing. It's an easy fix, I just set the state machine into an anim montage group. Now it works, but it's not perfect. You'll notice that there's breaks between animations. The attack to backstep is an easy fix since I just have to reduce the blend time, but the run to attack? That one's a nightmare to figure out. My attack animation started on a standing idle instead of a run, and then it had 3 whole frames going from standing to crouching before finally leaping forward. I swapped keyframes out and imported the new animation, and there we go, perfect. Now we'll do the same for all the other characters. Max fights with stones and throwing weapons, while Olivia fights with mourning doves. That's mourning with a U, to mourn or to grieve. Olivia, however, was a bit more tricky since I had to spawn a separate actor who would do actions as if it were a unit itself. You'll notice that these attacks are pretty flat and boring. They need more flair, they need to pop, and you gotta make the player feel the weight of a hit. And there's 5 ways to do that. Hit stun, hit stop, screen shake, particle effects, sound effects. I'm gonna be replacing these 3 drunkards, which, by the way, I can't really guarantee will return in the full game. Having to fight alcoholics on a regular basis is more indicative of a surface level urban problem, not really something supernatural. You feel me? Nah, instead, we're gonna have these 8th graders beat up their own teacher, and later, he's gonna fight back. I don't think I'm allowed to say that. With the attacks finished, we're good to continue. We could do a little more tweaking, movement speeds, animation speeds, backstep distances, but as it is, this is fine. Next up, ATB. This is perhaps the largest hump that I have to cross to make Suburban the game I want it to be, at least in terms of gameplay. Let's start by giving a little background on it, because this might be the last time I ever mention ATB again. Now, the ATB, or Active Time Battle System, was first patented alongside the release of Final Fantasy IV. It was a novel take on the turn-based RPG system that, in theory, would make for a more dynamic and fast-paced RPG. In practice, it led to long wait times just so players could take another action. The only exception to this was Final Fantasy X-2, where it was faster, it took notes from action games, and it incentivized you to keep your momentum up. But even X-2 had its own problems to contend with.
Get loose with it.
The patent has since expired. This was back around 2012. So let's boil down just what the ATB system actually does. 1. Units have a timer before their turn starts. The timer is called the initial engage. Even if the player's turn is ready, command, a unit makes their move. Someone else is in the middle of an action. 2. Units ready to take an action are basically, time continues flowing regardless of whether or not someone's turn is ready. If you don't select a move quickly, an enemy can easily get another hit on you. The most popular example of the ATB system in practice is Chrono Trigger. Final Fantasy X-2 builds on this by making most actions a free-for-all, where units can all attack at the same time. And one more thing. Is it a role-playing game as in the role of a warrior or the role of a wizard, or is it a role-playing game as in a dice roll? It seems like a stupid thing to ask, but looking at the ATB patent, which was drafted back in 1991, it's written like dice roll. Anyway, the ATB is done. That is, well, one of, if not the, biggest milestone for the project completed. With this, I can say with 100% confidence that I can complete this project. And mind you, this wasn't an easy task for me to solve. It was the hardest piece of scripting I've had to design and work out. There are no tutorials for how to design ATB in its entirety. Not for UE4, not for Unity, not even RPG Maker of all engines. There's some tweaks I want to do, like making the idle animations more dynamic, among other things, but by all means, this is already a lot completed. So thank you for watching. If you'd like to support the project, you can donate to the Patreon in the description, or you can simply like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is very much appreciated in either case. Stay tuned for the next update, where I go back into Blender and do a little level designing. And a big thank you goes out to Shaolin Dave McAlias, a Ghost Hunter tier Patreon supporter. Thanks so much for backing the project.